Okay, everyone. A quick discussion of immigration to get us started for our short little unit on immigration. We'll be talking in class this week and the beginning of next week about specific groups of people and the experiences they had when they came to the United States. But I just wanted to make sure that you had a general understanding of immigration before we jumped in and did anything specific. Some of this will be review. You studied immigration if you've been at HB since 5th grade. A lot of this is similar, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And again, any of this information could be useful in essay number 2 for the essay test if that's the one that you end up answering. Obviously, an immigrant is someone who is foreign born but recently moves to the United States. Often said that America is a country of immigrants. Other than Native Americans, no one else who is here was actually or indigenously from North America. Immigrants are usually people that come here voluntarily. That means that normally African Americans are excluded. At least African Americans who have ancestors who were slaves are excluded from immigration because they came here involuntarily. But most of our ancestors came to the country voluntarily, and thus they would be immigrants. Once someone is in the United States for a certain length of time, and definitely when their children are here, they have children here, they cease to be immigrants. So immigrants is sort of a temporary title that one would have that might eventually change. Immigrants come here for a variety of reasons, and one of the things we know is if we know where someone came from, we can usually have some good prediction of when they came to the United States, because oftentimes it was problems in their home country, sort of violence or other discrimination, different kinds of unrest, economic problems in a country that would cause people to come to the United States. Another big reason is that oftentimes corporations were advertising to get more workers to come to the United States. More workers meant a larger supply of workers, so you could pay them less. There was more competition for jobs. So you can find advertisements in newspapers all throughout Europe and in China as well, where companies are saying, come to America, it's really great here. Here are all these amazing things. This is where you get sometimes hear people say, the streets are paved with gold. Obviously they're not paved with gold, but sometimes people were told stories that were at least in part not true to get them to come to the United States. And we also should point out that not all immigrants who come here stay here permanently. In fact, sometimes the percentage is as high as 50% of all the immigrants who come to America don't stay. They make the decision to go back because it wasn't what they expected, or they missed their homes, or whatever the case may be. There are different groups of immigrants that come to the United States in different times. The pre-Civil War period, so 1820 to 1850, there are lots of immigrants that come to the United States, 2.5 million people. Most of these immigrants come from Western Europe, and the two largest groups that come are those from Ireland and those from southern Germany. One thing that would unite these two groups of people is that they were Roman Catholic. And that was a big problem for some people in the United States, because although Catholics today are not a group that we tend to think of as being discriminated against, because of religious differences in Europe between Protestants and Catholics, Catholics faced a lot of resistance in the United States. There was fear that Catholics would not be loyal to the country. Instead, they would be loyal to the Pope. And thus, that caused all kinds of sort of political and other tensions within America. And we'll be reading some specific ways that Irish Catholics were discriminated against in class later this week. Those who discriminated against immigrants, we give them the title nativists. So a nativist is someone who discriminates against an immigrant. That applies to the present as well. You could use that term today to talk about people who are discriminating against immigrants to the United States, more recently like Hispanic immigrants. But the irony is that very few of the nativists were actually natives to the United States. One of the things we'll see as we go through this quick unit is that oftentimes it was those who had come to the country and were sort of second generation that were those that did most of the discriminating. Obviously, the question at the bottom, if you've looked at it, has the answer of the Civil War. Very few people want to move to the United States in the middle of a war. So that slows the flow of immigration quite a bit. And it's not until the Civil War is over that a new group of immigrants will come along. I just want to point out quickly about this political cartoon, which is pretty famous and actually pretty amazing if you think about it. You see a scale in this cartoon. The scale is equal, meaning equal on both sides. So it's reached a balance. And if you notice, one side of the scale is south, one side of the scale is north. On the southern side, you see an African-American man, a very stereotypical image of one. And on the northern side, you see an Irishman. And the message of the cartoon is that these two people are equal, which, since it came out before the Civil War, this would have been a very startling thing, because we usually think of African Americans as facing the most discrimination, and pretty much they did, but Irish people faced an extreme amount of discrimination in the North prior to the Civil War and even after. And if you notice the way that this Irishman is drawn, he's given very animal-like characteristics. Looks very much like an ape of some sort. And this is done on purpose, again, to dehumanize this person, this Irishman. And many people at the time actually considered the Irish to not even be part of what we would consider to be white people, because they were seen as so inferior. And this is why the Irish face so much discrimination. Again, we'll be talking specifically about that in class, but I wanted to put this cartoon up and talk a little bit about it so you could think about that prior to our conversation. The immigrants who come after the Civil War are new immigrants, and at this point, things have shifted. The reason the Irish come in the 1820s to 1850s is because of a lot of poverty in Ireland. The potato famine is going on. There's a lot of unrest in Germany in the 1840s, huge economic problems, which is why Germans come. Unrest and warfare has sort of shifted in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s to Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And there's a lot of unrest in that part of Europe. So many of the immigrants who come after the Civil War are Eastern European or Southern European. So to just give a few examples, Italians, Poles, Russians, Slovenians, Czechs, Hungarians, Greeks, there are other groups too, but those are the ones that come in this later time. Obviously, a decent number of these people were Jewish, because there were Jewish people throughout all of these countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, and they oftentimes, because of discrimination, make the choice to come to the United States as well. And these groups there are millions and millions of these people, and it's interesting because Cleveland is a major destination for a lot of these people. At the time that the new immigrants are coming, Cleveland is really a booming city. In fact, at one point it was the fourth largest city in the United States because of the immigration of all of these different groups to our area. Obviously, life for immigrants could be quite hard. You see a picture here on the right of a lot of children living in what was known as a tenement house. A tenement house was a either quickly or poorly constructed apartment building, but these apartment buildings aren't like we think of an apartment building with permanent walls, so you would go to your particular apartment. Oftentimes, these tenement houses would just be more like warehouses with completely open floors. And families would just be separated by curtains. Or if there were walls, there might not be a lot of interior walls within an apartment. So it might be one room in which all of the members of the family, and they had lots of kids in this time period, would be living together. When immigrants move to the United States, they tend to cluster themselves together. That makes sense. You'd want to be around people who celebrated the same culture as you, spoke the same language, had the same religious holidays. The term for these cultural neighborhoods is ghettos. I know that's not what the word ghetto means today. When you hear the word ghetto today, usually it's in reference to a poor or a dangerous neighborhood in an inner city. But that's not the actual meaning of the word ghetto. A ghetto is just a place where people of the same ethnic group choose to live. So, for example, Little Italy in Cleveland would be a ghetto. Not the negative connotation that we tend to have with that word today, but it is a place where when Italian immigrants came to Cleveland, they chose to live there. There was a church that had Mass in Italian. There were restaurants, or there were grocery stores that had the ingredients they would need to cook food. That was part of their culture. All the things that would bring some of those feelings of being back in Italy and Sicily were present in that neighborhood. Obviously, immigrants, because they came with disadvantages, sometimes not knowing English, sometimes being lower skilled workers, took lower paying jobs, and they fill that sort of niche in our economy, and over time, they work their way up and become mainstreamed in with the rest of American society. These groups would oftentimes form benevolent societies. Life in America in the pre-1900s was not always easy. Cities that were growing very quickly did not necessarily have police departments, or at least formal police departments. They did not necessarily have fire departments that would protect the whole society. There was nothing like Social Security or Medicare, modern programs that we have to help assist people that are elderly or people that are sick. So that would mean that this would be left up to the immigrant groups. So you would have groups of Italians or groups of Germans or groups of Irish people who would join together and help out those in need. So if you were part of a benevolent society and your house burned down, the benevolent society would help to provide you with a place to stay, give you some money so that you could potentially begin to rebuild. If someone died, the benevolent society might pay for the burial. So you would be part of this group and you would contribute to the group. And then over time, the group would provide benefits that today, a lot of those benefits come from the government. But at the time, because the government was not nearly as active in helping its citizens, people took those responsibilities on themselves, and most of the time different ethnic groups would take those responsibilities upon themselves. Obviously, there was a lot of discrimination against different groups that we'll discuss more in class. Groups are formed like the Immigration Restriction League, specifically saying we should exclude people from the country. Depending on what the time period is, they're focused on different groups. Because we live on the East Coast, or near the East Coast of the United States, we get a pretty heavy focus on European immigrants. Because most of the European immigrants that came to the United States came through the East Coast, and a lot of them settled here in the Cleveland area. Non-European immigrants are a huge group of immigrants. And if we lived out on the West Coast, we would probably focus on this group more, just because more of the immigrants that come in through San Francisco and other places on the West Coast tended to be from Asia. Chinese Americans in particular faced an extreme amount of discrimination. In fact, the only group that has ever been specifically banned from coming to the United States were the Chinese. In 1882, something called the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and this said that it was illegal for Chinese people to come into America. Now, 160,000 people from Japan and China had already come to the United States before 1882, mostly to work on building the transcontinental railroads, but this law was specifically designed to target the Chinese and limit their ability to come into the United States, because the fear was they were taking over jobs and taking over whole industries, and this was disadvantaging American citizens. This plays itself out in a whole number of ways that we'll be talking about in class, and there's a lot of discrimination that goes on the West Coast against Asian immigrants. Not something we tend to associate with today, but definitely present in that time period. One more political cartoon before the video ends. You can see here a group of Chinese men trying to come to the United States. The government is standing up for them. Uncle Sam, representing the Americas, saying, why not give them a chance? And you see American workers, why they're wearing boxes on their head, I'm not 100% sure, trying to keep these Chinese Americans out, or Chinese people, they're not Americans yet, out. And it gives you a small snippet of what the conflict would be like between the nativists and the new immigrant groups. And we will spend more time in class this week talking about how these different groups, particularly the Jewish, the Irish, and the Chinese and Asian immigrants, faced discrimination and eventually became a more accepted part of American society.